December 30, 1944. At the bustling docks of Pearl Harbor, the tropical humidity clings to the steel hull of the USS Batfish as she prepares for her sixth war patrol. It is 9 a.m., and the quiet intensity of the crew is palpable. They are not merely heading out for another routine sweep of the Pacific. They are venturing into the closing acts of a global tragedy. At the helm of this Balao-class predator is Commander John K. Fife, a man whose reputation for precision and tactical aggression precedes him. As the lines are tossed and the diesel engines roar to life, the Batfish begins its long transit toward the Luzon Strait, a treacherous stretch of water between Taiwan and the Philippines that sailors have come to call Convoy College. By the time the Kala turns to January 1, 1945, the Batfish is clearing the harbor at midway at 2 p.m., cutting through the white-capped swells of the Central Pacific. The mission profile is clear but daunting. General Douglas MacArthur's forces are tightening their grip on the Philippines, and the Japanese Empire is in a state of chaotic retreat. High-level officials, skilled technicians, and critical supplies are being funneled through the Luzon Strait in a desperate attempt to reach the safety of the Japanese home islands. To facilitate this evacuation, the Imperial Japanese Navy has deployed its own silent hunters, the I-boats and RO boats, to protect the convoys and ferry the most precious cargo. For the crew of the Batfish, the prospect of engaging enemy submarines is a double-edged sword. Underwater combat is the rarest and most dangerous form of naval warfare. It is a game of acoustic shadows and electronic whispers where the hunter can become the prey in a heartbeat. Commander Fife knows that his greatest advantage lies not just in his Mark 14 torpedoes, but in the glowing screens of the SJ radar and the sensitive ears of the APR-1 radar detection gear. These tools allow the Batfish to see the electronic emissions of the enemy before the enemy ever knows they are being watched. In the pitch-black nights of the Pacific, this technology is the equivalent of a lantern in a dark room, though it is one that must be used with extreme caution to avoid giving away their own position. As the submarine pushes westward, the atmosphere inside the cramped, oil-scented corridors is one of focused preparation. Every man knows his station. They are 80 souls living in a pressurized tube, bound by the shared knowledge that their success deeps on stealth. The Luzon Strait is a graveyard of ships, a place where the currents are unpredictable and the threat of air attack is constant. Yet, as the sun sets over the Philippine Sea at 6:15 p.m. on their first week out, there is a sense of destiny among the officers. They are heading into the heart of the enemy's final defensive perimeter. The tactical situation in early 1945 is one of overwhelming American dominance, yet the Japanese remain a cornered and lethal adversary. Their submarines are larger, often carrying more firepower, and their crews are fueled by a fanatical refusal to surrender. Fife's orders are to disrupt these evacuation lines at any cost. He understands that every Japanese submarine sent to the bottom is not just a ship lost, but a vital artery of the empire severed. This patrol would not be defined by the number of merchant hulls sunk, but by a feat of concentrated lethality that would go down in the annals of naval history as an impossible record. The Luzon Strait was the throat of the Japanese Empire. If the Allies could squeeze it shut, the lifeblood of the war machine would cease to flow. By 10 a.m. on a Tuesday during their transit, Fife held a briefing in the cramped wardroom, the walls vibrating with the low-frequency hum of the diesels. He mapped out the patrol zones, stressing the importance of the blackout periods where they would run silent to avoid detection. The technology on the Batfish was a marvel of the age, but it still required human nerves to operate under pressure. As they neared the target zone at 11:30 p.m. on a moonless night, the tension reached a fever pitch. Every flicker on the radar screen was a potential death sentence or a moment of glory. To look back at the Batfish as she steamed toward her destiny is to see more than just a machine of war. She represented the pinnacle of American industrial might and the refined courage of the silent service. The men on board could not have known that within a span of 76 hours, they would achieve a tactical miracle that had never been seen before and would never be repeated. It is a legacy of technology meeting raw nerves, a testament to the brief, violent windows of opportunity that define greatness in the darkness of the deep. This was the prelude to a hunt that would cement Commander Fife's name in history, proving that even in the vastness of the Pacific, there was no place for the enemy to hide from the Batfish. It remains a poignant reminder that in the final dark hours of a conflict, the line between victory and oblivion is often drawn by the few who are willing to sail into the unknown. February 9, 1945, in the treacherous waters of the Babuyan Canal, the crew of the USS Batfish found themselves stalking a ghost in the moonless dark. The air inside the submarine was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and diesel oil, the low hum of the electric motors providing a rhythmic heartbeat to the mounting tension. At exactly 10:10 p.m., the radar operator's voice cut through the stillness of the conning tower. He had a contact, a faint pulse on the cathode ray tube that flickered with a life of its own. It was not the large, lumbering signature of a merchant vessel, nor was it the jagged, fast-moving return of a destroyer. This was something different. It was small, low to the water, and moving with a deliberate speed that suggested a vessel trying to remain unseen. Commander John Fife leaned over the glowing screen, his eyes narrowing as he processed the data. He knew instinctively that he had found his prey. This was the first of the Japanese submarines, likely the I-41, operating on the surface to gulp down fresh air and charge its depleted batteries before the dawn. Fife ordered the Batfish to begin its approach, moving with the predator's calculated grace. In the total darkness of the Philippine Sea, the radar was their only set of eyes, painting a digital map of an enemy that remained completely oblivious to the threat closing in. By 10:45 p.m., the distance had been cut to 6,000 yards. The men in the torpedo room worked in a practiced, ghostly silence, their hands moving over the cold steel of the Mark 18s with a reverence born of necessity. Every sailor on board understood the terrifying reality of sub versus sub combat. It was a rare, lethal dance where the traditional rules of naval engagement were discarded. There would be no warning shots and no chance for a parley. In this environment, the first captain to achieve a firing solution would likely be the only one to survive the night. The Japanese crew aboard the I-41 were likely exhausted, focused on the mechanical necessity of their transit rather than the invisible beams of radiation bouncing off their hull. They were part of a desperate reinforcement effort, a final attempt by the Imperial Japanese Navy to disrupt American operations around the Philippines. They did not know that they were being tracked with mathematical precision. As the clock ticked toward the late hours, the Batfish maneuvered into an ideal intercept position, cutting across the projected path of the Japanese boat. At 11:50 p.m., the tension reached a breaking point. Fife checked the bearings one last time, his voice calm as he gave the order that would decide the fate of dozens of men. 4 torpedoes leaped from the forward tubes, the sudden change in pressure causing the Batfish to shudder as if it were exhaling. The crew held their collective breath, some staring at the bulkheads as if they could see through the steel, others counting the seconds in a low whisper. They waited for the sound that would signify either a successful kill or a catastrophic failure. Then the night was torn asunder. A massive explosion erupted in the distance, followed almost immediately by a second, even more violent blast that vibrated through the hull of the Batfish. On the radar screen, the steady pulse that had represented the I-41 vanished instantly. The Japanese submarine had been broken in two, its pressure hull shattered by the force of the American torpedoes. There were no survivors, no distress signals, and no wreckage left to mark the spot where the vessel had gone down. There was only a massive, roiling patch of oil and the sudden, heavy silence of the deep Pacific. This first victory was a psychological turning point for the crew and a stark demonstration of the technological shift in underwater warfare. It proved that the American mastery of radar had effectively stripped the Japanese fleet of its greatest defense, the cover of darkness. The sinking of the I-41 was the opening act of a 76-hour window that would see the Batfish achieve the impossible, cementing a record that has never been broken. It serves as a haunting testament to the clinical efficiency of the submarine service, where victory is often won by men who never see the faces of their enemies. The legacy of the Batfish is one of cold, calculating persistence, a reminder that in the vast and indifferent reaches of the ocean, the difference between a hero and a casualty is measured in a few well-timed seconds and the courage to fire into the unknown. It remains a poignant echo of a time when the darkness was not a shield, but a trap for those who did not realize they were being watched. This first duel was the moment the hunters realized that the only thing more dangerous than the sea itself was a ghost with a radar screen. February 11, 1945, in the churning, lightless corridors of the Babuyan Channel, the crew of the USS Batfish found no respite in their recent victory. Just hours had passed since their first successful intercept, but the adrenaline of the kill had been replaced by a cold, calculating alertness. They were back on the hunt, patrolling an area of the Philippine Sea that had become a vital escape route for a collapsing Japanese empire. At 7:15 p.m., the silence of the conning tower was broken by the sharp, rhythmic ping of the SJ radar. The operator, S.N. Akers, didn't need a second look to know what he was seeing. A faint, intermittent return had appeared on the edge of the scope, blinking like a dying star. It was the electronic signature of another predator, the Japanese submarine RO-112. Moving through the swells with the same lethal intent as the Batfish, Commander John K. Fife moved to the scope, his eyes reflecting the pale green glow of the radar's screen. This second encounter was not a coincidence, it was a pattern. The Japanese were desperately trying to ferry high-ranking officials and critical supplies out of Luzon, and they were using the cover of darkness and the perceived safety of the underwater transit to do it. But the Batfish was no ordinary observer. It was equipped with the latest in American microwave technology, a tool that turned the pitch-black night into a transparent playground. By 8 p.m., the Batfish began its approach, carving through the water at high speed to get ahead of the target's projected path. The pursuit of RO-112 was a masterclass in patience and technological superiority. Unlike the surface battles that defined much of the Pacific War, this was duel of shadows and invisible waves. The Japanese were utilizing their own Type 13 radar, a system capable of detecting aircraft and large ships, but it lacked the resolution and the low-profile detection capabilities of the American SJ set. It was a technological mismatch that fundamentally altered the stakes of the engagement. At 8:40 p.m., Fife ordered the boat to a more aggressive intercept course. The crew worked in a practiced, hushed choreography. In the torpedo room, the men adjusted the settings on the Mark 14 torpedoes, knowing that a single mechanical failure could give their position away and turn the hunter into the hunted. As the clock struck 9 p.m., the distance between the two submarines closed to 8,000 yards. The Batfish was running on the surface, using its superior speed to flank the RO-112. The tension inside the American boat was a heavy physical presence. Every man knew that if the RO-112 decided to dive, the radar advantage would vanish, and the battle would desk into a chaotic game of sonar and depth charges where the odds were far less certain. By 9:50 p.m., the gap had narrowed to 6,000 yards. Fife was waiting for the perfect angle, a solution that would leave the Japanese commander no room to maneuver. At 10:15 p.m., the Batfish reached its firing position. The sea was restless, seeing sprays of salt over the bridge, but the radar lock remained steady. The RO-112 was still oblivious, steaming ahead toward a destination it would never reach. Fife took one last look at the data provided by the torpedo data computer, the mechanical brain of the submarine that calculated lead, speed, and distance. At 10:43 p.m., the order was given. 3 torpedoes were fired in a tight spread, their steam-powered engines roaring to life as they surged toward the unsuspecting target. For 60 seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, at 10:44 p.m., the horizon was torn apart by a violent, orange-white flash. The impact was so powerful that it shook the Batfish nearly 3 miles away. The RO-112 did not sink in the traditional sense. It was obliterated. A second, internal explosion followed as the Japanese boat's own torpedoes and fuel stores ignited, sing a plume of debris, and fire hundreds of feet into the midnight sky. When the Batfish moved to the site of the sinking, there was no debris field to navigate, only a thick, cloying slick of oil and the haunting silence of an empty ocean. The destruction of RO-112 in such rapid succession after their first kill was more than just a tactical success. It was a psychological triumph. It proved that the Batfish possessed an almost supernatural ability to find and destroy the enemy in the total absence of light. This feat would go on to be remembered as one of the most incredible displays of submarine warfare in history, shifting the narrative of the underwater war from one of luck to one of absolute scientific dominance. The legacy of this engagement lies in the realization that the nature of war had changed forever. The courage of the sailors was now intertwined with the precision of their machines, creating a lethal synergy that made the ocean depths a graveyard for those who could not see. It serves as a poignant reminder that in the vastness of the sea, the most dangerous enemy is not the one you can see, but the ghost that tracks your every move from the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. February 13, 1945. In the treacherous and churning waters of the Babuyan Channel, Commander John K. Fife paced the cramped quarters of the USS Batfish as a heavy silence settled over his crew. They had already accomplished what few submariners even dared to dream of: sink 2 Imperial Japanese Navy submarines to the bottom in less than 3 days. But the ocean is a greedy mistress, and the intelligence reports suggested that the dance of death was not yet over. Somewhere in the pitch-black depths of the Luzon Strait, a third sister of the deep was lurking, unaware that the predator above was closing the net. Just after 2 a.m. on this humid Tuesday morning, the rhythmic pulse of the SJ radar screen flickered with a hauntingly familiar green glow. At a distance of nearly 11,000 yards, a solid blip appeared. It was moving slowly, likely surfaced to charge its batteries, just as its predecessors had done. This was RO-113, a Kaichu-type submarine, and it was walking directly into a trap laid by perhaps the most lethal submarine crew in the Pacific. Fife ordered the Batfish to close the distance, his voice steady as the tension in the boat reached a fever pitch. Every man on board knew they were on the verge of making history, but a single mistake, a stray sound, or a delayed reaction could flip the script and ess them all to a watery grave. By 3:15 a.m., the gap had closed to 7,000 yards. The Batfish was running on the surface, its dark hull bling into the midnight waves, while the Japanese crew likely believed they were alone in the vastness of the sea. There is a specific kind of terror in submarine warfare that exists nowhere else. It is a slow, methodical hunt where the hunter must remain invisible while staring directly at the prey through the cold eye of technology. At 4:12 a.m., Fife brought the Batfish into a prime firing position. He didn't want to leave anything to chance this time. He waited, letting the distance drop further, watching the radar pings as if they were the heartbeat of the enemy. At 4:48 a.m., the order was finally given to fire. 3 Mark 18 torpedoes hissed out of the forward tubes, their electric motors leaving no wake for the enemy to spot. The seconds that followed were an eternity. In the control room, men held their breath, counting the time it took for the steel fish to travel through the brine. Then the ocean erupted. A massive fireball bloomed on the horizon, illuminating the spray and the dark silhouettes of the nearby islands. The sound of the explosion was followed by the sickening, metallic crunch of a hull collapsing under the weight of the Pacific. RO-113 was gone, vanished in an instant with all hands. As the sun began to peek over the horizon at 6 a.m., the crew of the Batfish realized the magnitude of their feat. They had destroyed 3 enemy submarines in just 76 hours. It was a record that would never be broken, a hat trick of destruction that defied the odds of naval engagement. They had turned the hunter into the hunted with such surgical precision that it felt less like a battle and more like a mathematical certainty. But even in the glow of victory, there was a sobering reality to the success. The legacy of the Batfish and her impossible record remains a testament to a turning point in human conflict where the machine began to outpace the man. In those 76 hours, the nature of the Pacific War was distilled into its most raw and terrifying form. It was no longer just about the bravery of the individual sailor or the grit of the commander, though those remained essential. It was about the cold, calculating efficiency of radar and the silent, invisible trajectory of the torpedo. The sinking of RO-113 closed a chapter on Japanese naval dominance and signaled the of an era where a submarine could find safety in the dark. Today we look back at these events not just as a series of tactical victories, but as a haunting echo from the deep. Every wreck resting on the floor of the Babuyan Channel is a monument to the thousands of souls who never returned, men who were caught in the gears of a global machine they could not control. The USS Batfish achieved the impossible, but in doing so it revealed the grim truth of modern war. In the ocean remains indifferent to the triumphs and tragedies of those who sail upon it. It swallows the victor and the vanquished alike, leaving only the ripples of history to remind us that beneath the waves, the silence is always absolute, and the ghosts of the deep never truly rest. February 13, 1945, in the churning, predatory waters of the Luzon Strait, the USS Batfish finally turned its bow away from the kill zone. Behind them lay a graveyard of imperial Japanese steel and a legacy that would echo through the decades as one of the most remarkable feats in naval history. In just 76 hours, this single American submarine had rewritten the book on undersea warfare. The destruction of 3 enemy submarines in such a compressed time frame was not merely a tactical fluke. It was a demonstration of a shifting tide in the Pacific that the Japanese High Command could no longer ignore. By the time the sun rose on February 14, the strategic landscape of the region had been irrevocably altered. The Japanese Navy's desperate attempt to evacuate high-ranking personnel and deliver vital supplies to the besieged garrisons in the Philippines had been shattered by the Batfish's relentless pursuit. The loss of those 3 boats represented more than just the loss of tonnage. It was the loss of some of the most experienced submariners remaining in the Emperor's fleet. As the Batfish cut through the waves toward the safety of the south, the crew lived in a state of hypervigilance, their nerves frayed, but their spirits buoyed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had lived through a tension few humans could ever comprehend, stalking hunters who were just as lethal and invisible as they were. The silence of the boat, once heavy with the fear of being detected, was now replaced by the quiet pride of a crew that knew they had done the impossible. On March 3, 1945, at 10 a.m., the Batfish finally cleared the breakwater at Fremantle, Australia. The reception on the pier was unlike any other. Word of their exploit had preceded them, traveling through the secret channels of the silent service. Admiral James Christie, the commander of American submarines in the Southwest Pacific, was there to meet them personally. It is said that when Commander Jake Fife stepped onto the dock, the weight of the achievement began to settle over the men. They were no longer just another crew returning from a standard patrol. They were the holders of a record that many naval historians believed would never be challenged. The strategic impact of those 3 days radiated far beyond the Luzon Strait. The Japanese military had relied on their submarine force to provide a lifeline to isolated outposts when surface ships could no longer survive the gauntlet of American air power. With the Batfish proving that even the depths were no longer safe, that lifeline was effectively severed, leaving thousands of Japanese troops stranded and without hope of reinforcement or escape. The psychological blow to the Japanese submarine arm was equally devastating. To lose 3 vessels to a single predator in such a short window sent a clear message that the technological gap had become a chasm. The Batfish's masterful use of the SJ radar to detect the enemy's own radar emissions changed the nature of the hunt forever. It was a pioneering moment where electronic warfare dictated the outcome of the most dangerous game in the world. For the men of the Batfish, the transition back to civilian life after the war was a journey from the extraordinary to the mundane, yet those 76 hours remained the defining moment of their existence. Commander Fife would eventually be awarded his 3rd Navy Cross for this patrol, cementing his place in the pantheon of naval legs. In a turn of fate that few could have predicted, the Leggery Hunter found a second life far from the salt air of the Pacific. Today, the USS Batfish sits in a memorial park in Muskogee, Oklahoma, a silent sentinel resting on the dry land of the American heartland. It serves as a physical reminder of a time when the fate of nations rested on the shoulders of men in cramped, pressurized tubes beneath the sea. Reflecting on those 3 days in February, we see that history is often forged in the intersection of human courage and the cold precision of technology. But beneath the accolades and the records lies a more sobering truth. Every torpedo that found its mark and every hull that imploded represented dozens of lives extinguished in the dark, cold vacuum of the ocean. The Batfish achieved the impossible, carving its name into the chronicles of war with a precision that remains unmatched to this day. Yet, the legacy of that achievement is not found in the steel of the ship or the ink on the commissions. It is found in the luring silence of the Luzon Strait, where the ghosts of the hunters and the hunted remain locked in a perpetual embrace. The record is a scar on the timeline of the 20th century, a reminder that in the absolute dark of the ocean, victory is a fragile thing, bought with the currency of souls. We look back at the Batfish not just to celebrate a feat of arms, but to acknowledge the terrible cost of a peace that was forged in the fires of such relentless destruction. The sea may eventually forget the names of the ships and the men, but history does not, and the 76 hours of the USS Batfish remain a haunting echo of a time when the world was on fire and the only way to survive was to become the ultimate predator of the deep. February 15, 1945, in the humid, salt-slicked air of the South China Sea, the USS Batfish finally turned her bow away from the graveyard she had created. The hunt was over, but the silence that followed the final explosion was heavier than any depth charge. For 76 hours, the world for Commander John Fife and his crew had been reduced to the green glow of a radar screen and the jagged pings of the sonar. They had achieved something no other vessel in the history of naval warfare had done, or would likely ever do again. They had hunted the hunters, sinking 3 enemy submarines in a single patrol, all within the span of 3 days. It was a feat of technical brilliance and raw nerves, yet as the adrenaline faded into the exhaustion of a successful war patrol, the true magnitude of what they had done began to take root in the collective memory of the United States Navy. The legacy of the Batfish is not merely found in the 3 kill symbols painted on her conning tower. It is found in the way she fundamentally proved the mastery of American technology over the vastness of the Pacific. At 11 p.m. on those fateful nights, the Batfish was using invisible waves of radio energy to see through the pitch-black darkness, finding enemies who thought they were hidden by the very curvature of the earth. This was the dawn of a new kind of war, one where the human eye was no longer the primary observer, and where the difference between life and a watery grave was measured in the milliseconds it took for a radar pulse to return to its mast. The silent service earned its name through discretion, but the Batfish gave that name a terrifying new meaning. To the Japanese sailors in those final months of the war, the ocean had become a sentient enemy, an environment where death could arrive from an unseen foe without a moment's warning. As we look back at the Batfish today, we are forced to confront the duality of her story. She is a marvel of engineering, a testament to the bravery of the 50,000 men who volunteered for submarine duty, knowing that 1 in 4 of them would never return home. But she is also a reminder of the staggering loss of life that defines the Pacific theater. Each time a torpedo from the Batfish found its mark, it extinguished dozens of lives in an instant. Those Japanese submariners were men with families, letters in their lockers, and dreams of a home they would never see again. They were consumed by the same ocean that the Batfish navigated so skillfully. The sea does not take sides, and it does not offer a burial ground for those lost in the abyss. It simply remains, vast and indifferent, long after the fires of the engines have gone cold. In the decades since the war, the Batfish has found an unlikely final resting place in the heart of the American plains. Resting in a park in Muskogee, Oklahoma, far from the crashing waves and the pressure of the depths, she serves as a physical link to a generation that is rapidly fading into the mist of history. When visitors walk through her cramped passageways at 2 p.m. on a quiet afternoon, they feel the cold steel that once protected 80 men from the crushing weight of the ocean. They can almost hear the ghost of the klaxon and the frantic whispers of a crew rigged for silent running. The submarine is no longer a predator. She is a teacher. She stands as a monument to the incredible things that ordinary men can achieve when the world is at its darkest, and a warning about the terrible price that must be paid for the preservation of freedom. The 76 hours of the USS Batfish remain a singular event, a moment where skill, luck, and technology converged to create a leg yet, beyond the records and the medals. The true echo of the deep is a call for remembrance. We remember the Batfish not just for the ships she sank, but for the resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute terror. The silent service remains silent because many of its stories are buried miles beneath the surface, protected by the same waters that witnessed the Batfish's triumph. We are left to wonder about the souls still resting in the rusted hulls of the RO-112 and her sisters, and we are left to honor the men of the Batfish who bore the heavy burden of victory. The ocean may eventually forget the names of the ships and the men, but history does not. The saga of the Batfish is a haunting reminder that in the absolute dark of the ocean, victory is a fragile thing, bought with the currency of souls. It is a story that ends not with a shout of triumph, but with a profound, lingering silence that mirrors the very depths where the Batfish once reigned supreme.